Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here for this lesson. In this video, we're going to be talking about the structures in our organizations, how we determine the structures in our organizations, and how these structures impact outcomes for our employees and the organizations themselves. Now, you might be watching this video and wondering, what is the relevance of organizational structure to organizational behavior? Isn't this more of a strategy issue, you might be thinking? Well, yes, organizational structure is relevant to strategy, but it's also highly relevant to organizational behavior because if you think about it, everything that we talk about in this course, in this series of lessons deals with how people behave in different situations. Okay. And we talk a lot about contextual factors and contingency variables, and our structure is one of those contingency variables. We're going to start by talking about 7 elements of an organization's structure. And the first one we're going to discuss here is called work specialization. This deals with the degree to which activities are subdivided into separate jobs. Okay. So work specialization is basically how we determine the work that people are going to do. Are they going to do an all encompassing job or are they going to do a very small portion of the job? And Henry Ford provides a great example of work specialization. Many people think of Henry Ford as being a founder of the automobile, but Ford didn't invent the automobile. What Ford did was Ford brought efficiency to the building of the automobile. He introduced the assembly line to this process. So prior to Henry Ford, automobiles were produced in what they called boutiques, where an individual went through the entire process of building a car, or a small group of individuals may have. Okay, but Ford took a look at this and said, I don't need people who are experts in building an entire car. I need somebody who can build a door. I need somebody who can put a right wheel on a car. I need somebody who can make a windshield. Okay. And came up with this idea of specialization. So people became fixed at doing specific tasks, and then those tasks were all put together. So, one of the things that we have to look at in our structure is what type of specialization do we want to have? Do we want people to do all encompassing jobs, or do we want them to focus on doing one thing very well and very efficiently? And there are trade offs here, okay? Because when we specialize, we become very good at doing something, but our employees may also get bored and it can impact their motivation. Now, building off of the trade offs that we just discussed here, what we can see in this graph is that as work specialization increases, so does our productivity. But that only happens to a point because at some point, what happens is there are kind of diseconomies that we experience. Okay. And some of these things may be related to lack of motivation, other things may be related to having people who are so specialized that they can't do other jobs. So I'll give you an example. When I was in industry, I managed a pricing group, and each person in my team had a specific area that they worked on. Okay, so I was in the building materials industry, and one person did quotes for lumber, and another person did quotes for doors and trim, and another person did windows, and so on and so forth. But what happened was, if there weren't window quotes, but there were lumber quotes to be done, and the window person didn't necessarily know how to do lumber quotes, so they couldn't help with that, and they essentially were sitting at their desk with nothing to do. Okay. So we actually ended up going through some cross training and kind of broadening the scope of people's jobs so that we could benefit a little bit from having the ability to help each other because we had such tight specialization that depending on what the workflow looked like, we had times where our people had no work that they could actually complete. Another important component to our structure is departmentalization. And this is when we group our jobs together based upon the work that's being done. Okay. So sometimes we group by functions, and that would be like putting an accounting team together, putting a marketing team together, and so on and so forth. We also can group by the type of product or service that the organization produces. So, for example, the ITT Corporation used to own both Sheraton Hotels and the New York Knicks, but they obviously had people grouped differently based upon whether or not they worked in the hotel division or whether or not they worked in the NBA, the sports division. Okay. We also see groups by geography or territory. This is particularly important when an organization is multinational, but we even see it within companies that are just in one country. Okay, so back when I was in industry, I worked for a lumber yard that had 450 locations across the United States. All right, and there were four different divisions, like a Northeast division, a Southeast division, a Southwest, and a Northwest division. Okay, and then within those different divisions, there there were districts that were based on geography and so on and so forth. Okay. Then we also can look at process differences, and process differences is a lot like functions performed, but basically it deals with where in the process somebody provides service. So if you ever go into a fast food restaurant, sometimes there's one person who rings you out and another person who hands you your food. They're at different points in that process. And then also we look at the type of customer. So in my industry, we dealt with large home builders, we dealt with remodelers, we dealt with just regular customers who had homes that they wanted to fix up, and they were all different types of customers. And very often we had different types of salespeople that dealt with different types of customers. We also need to take a look at the chain of command within our organizations. Okay, and the chain of command basically deals with who we report to. All right, so for example, as a professor, I am part of a department and I report to my department chair. And my department is part of a school, and our department chairs all report directly to our dean. Okay, and our dean is part of a college, and the dean reports to the provost, and the provost reports to the president. So basically, as you look at from the president to the provost to the dean to the department chair to the faculty. That is our chain of command that we follow. Okay. And within that chain of command, there are a couple concepts that we want to make sure we understand. And one is unity of command. And unity of command deals with getting the same direction from different people within the chain. Okay. So the direction that I get from my dean should be consistent with the direction that I get from my department chair. All right. And then there's also authority, and authority deals with, does somebody really have the right to give direction? All right. So if you're in a job and your boss tells you to do something, you're probably going to be more likely to want to listen to that than if somebody who you view as a coworker tells you to do something. And that's because your boss has authority. Building on the idea of unity of command, here's a scenario for you to consider. Okay, imagine Alice works in the home goods department of a large retail store. Because the store has long hours, maybe they're open 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 days a week. She doesn't always get to work with her department supervisor or the assistant store manager who oversees her department. Sometimes the acting manager gives her directives that differ from the instructions left by her department supervisor. So the acting manager might be an assistant store manager who oversees departments that are different from Alice's, and this person's giving directions that are different from what her direct supervisor is giving her. So think about what challenges related to unity of command and authority might be present in this situation, and what type of outcomes can you foresee? Well, this is a real problem that we have in our organizations, and I used to see this back when I was in the field quite a bit. And the reason that this would come up is because acting managers would have specific things that they were trying to deal with that day. Maybe there was an advertisement that they had to prepare for. Maybe there was a specific event that was going on that they needed people to support. Whereas department supervisors and assistant store managers who oversaw departments, they had different objectives. They had strategic objectives for their departments. So they would give one set of directives, acting managers would have a completely different set of needs, and then employees would be kind of caught in the middle and they wouldn't know who to follow. Well, ultimately, they often followed the acting manager because they saw the acting manager as being the immediate person they needed to respond to. Additionally, the acting manager had the ability to put a different type of pressure on them than than a supervisor who was not present. Okay, and then what do you think happened when the employee's supervisor came into work? They would look and say, "Oh my gosh, this person didn't do anything I asked them for," and it would impact their perception of that employee. All right. So these were definitely some challenges that we had because we had inaccurate perceptions of employees as a result of this. We also had important work that wasn't getting done. So one of the things that I kind of instituted as a manager to help address this was I went around and I told my managers who worked underneath me that if you were an acting manager and you were giving a directive to somebody who didn't report directly to you, let's start with asking them what directions they have to follow for the day. Okay, so what has your supervisor assigned for you today? Because then we can at least take that information into context and consider it and try to align the directives that we're giving. There is some argument that the chain of command is a little bit less relevant today than it has been in the past because of trends like technology and empowering people. Okay, so self-managed teams, cross-functional teams, they kind of reduce the need for the chain of command, and our employees having access to data that they didn't have in the past. For example, being able to see when certain orders are coming in or understanding costs and gross profit margins and things like that in ways that they may not have in the past can reduce the need to rely on the chain of command. But the chain of command is still fairly important within organizations, as there does have to be accountability for our employees. Related to the chain of command is the span of control. And the span of control deals with how many individuals a manager can efficiently and effectively direct. Okay. In a narrow span of control, each manager has a lower number of employees, but we have a higher number of levels within the organization. All right. When we have a wider span of control, each manager has more employees and we have fewer levels within the organization. So if you look at the chart here, you can see kind of the difference between a narrower and a wider span of control. And what you see here as you look at this is that over on the left, we're assuming a span of control of 4 people per manager, and over on the right, we're looking at 8. And what happens is with only 4 people per manager, if we have 4,096 employees, we have to go down to 7 levels. Okay. And that puts us in a situation where we have over 1,300 managers. All right. With the span of control of 8, we actually only have 5 levels here for the same number of employees and fewer than 600 managers. So we have more than twice as many managers when we have a narrower span of control. All right. And that's pretty much what we would expect there. And why that might be a little bit problematic is because managers get paid more. So now we're actually paying somebody to manage and we're paying that person a premium. So many companies are trending towards trying to have wider spans of control so they can reduce the number of managers that they have in their organization. Of course, what your span of control looks like is really dependent upon the job that you're doing. Okay, there are some positions where people interact very rarely with their supervisor, and there's other positions where people have to interact more closely. And depending on how close those interactions need to be, that's also going to influence what our span of control looks like. Another thing that you want to consider here as we consider our factors that are going to contribute to span of control is that our span of control does not have to be the same throughout our organization. We might have some levels where the span of control is different than others. We may have certain divisions where the span of control is different than others. All right, it really should be driven by the work that's being done. We also need to consider where decision making happens. Okay, so who has the authority to make decisions? And as we consider this question, we often look at centralized versus decentralized organizations. And in centralized organizations, most of the decisions get made at a single point. So maybe it's in your corporate offices, maybe there's certain executives that make decisions. And in decentralized organizations, decisions can be made at the ground level. They can be made by people who are going to be impacted by the decisions. Okay, and I've worked in both types of organizations, and there are benefits to both. Okay, I particularly enjoyed working in a decentralized organization. One company that I worked for, the store that I was managing, I had all sorts of authority regarding decisions that we made as far as pricing, decisions that we made as far as inventory. Um, and I could go out there and I could say, "Hey, I want to get rid of a product line," and it was no problem. Or I could bring in a whole new product line, and it was no problem. And at one point in time, I remember my boss, my district manager, actually didn't even know that I had brought in a whole new product line till he showed up unannounced in my store, was walking through an aisle, and he looked at the aisle and he said, "You changed over this entire aisle. You didn't have this product line here before." And I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "Nobody stocks this." And I said, "Yeah, I know." And I kind of walked through the numbers that drove my decision and why I made this decision. He said, this was a really gutsy move, but I like it. Let's see how it works out. It'll be interesting. Okay. And sometimes I would make decisions that worked out really well, and sometimes I'd make decisions that I learned from, but I never lost that authority to make those decisions because our organization was decentralized. And it really served me well overall because I was able to adapt to the needs of my customers and grew my sales quite a bit as a result of having that authority. Now, I've also worked in a centralized organization, and a centralized organization, like I said, the corporate offices will make a lot of decisions, or there may be an executive who makes a decision. And in these types of organizations, not only could I not decide what product lines I wanted to have and what product lines I wanted to discontinue, but I couldn't even make decisions about where I wanted those product lines to be in my store. I remember when I first got hired by a centralized organization, I moved a product line based upon a conversation that I'd had with my manager, and they'd said, "Hey, I think this is a good idea," and I went ahead and did it. And when they saw that I did it, they said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you didn't go through corporate to get approval for this." And it was a real learning experience for me, having come from decentralized organizations, that authority was so different in this company. Now, centralization does have its benefits, though, and one of the benefits is that it provides consistency for employees, it provides consistency for customers. And if you think about this, McDonald's is an organization that's fairly centralized. Okay, and they have decisions that they make. Nobody in the store makes a decision about how much ketchup to put on a burger. Okay, the company has a specific recipe, you have to follow it. But the benefit of that is that if you're driving from New York to Florida for spring break and you stop at McDonald's several times along the way, you know that your burger is going to be consistent along that ride. So one of the benefits of centralization is that we make decisions with understanding that our customers want consistency, and that can help our sales in a different way. So as we look at our structure and think about where does decision making authority lie, we have to think about who our stakeholders are, who we're trying to serve, and what benefits we're trying to achieve out of centralization versus decentralization. Related to centralization and decentralization of authority is formalization. And this is the degree to which jobs within the organization are standardized. So, are there rules and regulations kind of defining what you do? So, the McDonald's example that I gave before is a highly formalized job, meaning that the employees don't really have a lot of choices they can make. You can't change the amount of ketchup or mustard you're going to put on a burger. You have to put the same amount of onions on each time. That's not your choice. Okay. In a low formalization situation, employees have more decisions about what they can do. They can kind of use their own discretion to figure out how to do a job best. So, for example, when I was in an organization where we had low formalization, um, we didn't have specific scripts or tactics that we had to follow to get sales. We basically could get sales by doing whatever it was that we thought we needed to do at the time, within reason, obviously, to meet the needs of our customers. So, for example, I was going after a customer. I went out to their job site. The customer had a bad relationship with my company. Basically, told me to leave the job site right away, and then he jokingly said, "Yeah, and if you ever come back here, you better at least have a six pack on you." And I said, "Okay." And I walked away. I said, "I got something I can work with here." So a week later, I went to a local convenience store, bought a six pack of beer, and showed up at the job site. And the guy said, "Hey, I thought I told you to never come back." And I said, "No, you told me if I ever came back that I better have a six pack." And I laid it on a bunk of lumber, and I said, "You need me, you know where to call." Well, I'll tell you what, within a couple weeks, he actually came in, let me bid on some jobs for him, and within a year, he was one of my top customers. Okay. But the only reason I was able to land that account was because we had low formalization, because I had discretion I could use in my job. Most places you couldn't go ahead and do what I did to land that account. But in that specific case, I had the ability to make the decision about what the right thing to do was to open up the door to conversation there. And I ended up landing one of my largest accounts because of it. The last element of structure that we're going to cover here is, do individuals from different areas need to regularly interact. Okay. And when they do, this is called boundary spanning. Okay. And it's when people form relationships with those outside of their formally assigned groups. All right. So as a manager, I had to boundary span quite a bit because I often needed help with different aspects of inventory management. Maybe I needed approvals from my credit office. There's a variety of different things that I needed. So I had to build relationships with our pricing managers, with our credit officers, with our purchasers. Okay. And taking the time building these relationships is what we call boundary spanning. Now that we've talked about the elements of organizational structure, we're going to discuss some of the frameworks for our structures. And the first one is a simple structure, and this is one where the manager and the owner are one and the same. Okay, and you see over on the right here, I've got a little picture of Mr. Slate from the Flintstones. And if you ever watch the Flintstones, Fred Flintstone, the main character, works in a rock quarry, and Mr. Slate is his boss. And everybody talks to Mr. Slate about everything. Mr. Slate is interacting directly with all the machine operators and everything. There appear to be no managers in between the employees and the owner. That's an example of a simple structure. All right. And some of us have probably worked in simple structures before. When I was in high school, I worked at a small electronics store where there was the owner and then just a small number of employees. And the owner was the boss to all of us. All right. And some of the advantages of a simple structure are that they, can be fast and flexible. So you have access to the decision makers. They can make decisions pretty quickly. They're inexpensive in the sense that we're not paying a lot of different levels of management. And we also, we know who we're accountable to. Okay. Weaknesses, however, are that they can be difficult to maintain in anything other than a small organization. The reason for this is that as your organization grows, it's very challenging for the owner to interact with everybody. If you have 5 or 10 people, that works well. That's fine. But, once you start to get up into 20, 25, 30 people, now that becomes a rather wide span of control for one person to manage. Okay, and they're also a little bit risky in the sense that everything depends on one person. If the owner gets sick or if the owner has to go out of town, now all of a sudden we don't have anybody who easily slides into that leadership position. This slide here just shows you an example of what a simple structure looks like from an organizational standpoint. And what you see here is that you have your owner, Jack Gold in this example, and all of our salespeople and our cashier all report to Jack. So even though the salespeople may do a very different job than the cashier does, they all report to the same person. Now, as organizations grow, we often see them transition into something called the bureaucracy. All right. And bureaucracy is a word that you may have heard before as people complain about their jobs and talk about the bureaucracy of where they work. But the reality is that bureaucracy is just a term that is used to describe the structure of our organization. And a bureaucracy is characterized by standardization. So when we transition into a bureaucracy, we do things like develop highly routine operating tasks, meaning that we now have processes that we follow that are a little more standardized than they were before. And to support the standardization of these processes, we formalize rules and regulations. You'll start to see things like policy manuals emerge, and tasks get grouped into functional departments. So, for example, in a restaurant under a simple structure, when a customer leaves, you may see anyone who's available just clear the table. Okay, but in a bureaucracy, we'll start to identify the task of clearing the table, the task of removing dishes, taking them to the back, wiping down the table, etc., all fall under a department that we call like a busing department. Okay. Now, decisions within the bureaucracy start to follow the chain of command. So, that busing department would have somebody who's a supervisor. And if the people who are responsible for clearing the tables have something that they'd like to change or they need a scheduling change, etc., they would go to the supervisor for that department. All right. We also see a little more narrow spans of control within the bureaucracy because rather than having 20, 25 people reporting to the owner, people are reporting to whoever is the head of their functional department. And decision making is a little more centralized within the organization. Now, bureaucracies certainly have some advantages. For one, they allow us to perform standardized activities more efficiently than we could in other organizational structures. They also allow us to use managers that are not necessarily the most talented managers because the structure and policy of the organization start to compensate a little bit for any gaps in managerial skill. That can also be a weakness, however, okay, because these policies covering for gaps in managerial skills may mask the fact that we need stronger management within the organization. All right. We also sometimes see subunit conflicts within bureaucracies, and this can be for a variety of reasons. One is that when we do have weak management, they're not as effective at managing some of these conflicts. The other component is there's a high emphasis on departmentalization within the bureaucracy. Okay, so as a result, we have these conflicts and unit goals start to dominate what people focus on. We also see a little bit of obsessive behavior within bureaucracies. So what'll happen is people become very focused on procedures and policies and things of that nature, and they'll become almost obsessed with how it is that we are complying with these policies and procedures rather than focusing on goals of the organization. Within the bureaucracy, we have functional structure, and this is where employees are grouped based upon their roles or tasks. So we see accounting departments, marketing departments, things of that nature. And then we also have divisional structure, which is where we group employees based upon products, services, customers, or geographic markets. Building on a bureaucracy, we have a matrix structure, and this combines two forms of departmentalization in terms of functional and product departmentalization. Okay. And in a matrix structure, people kind of report in two different ways. So they'll report to somebody from their functional department and somebody from their product department. And the strength of this is that it helps us put specialists together while also facilitating coordination. Okay. But there's also some duplicity of activities and costs within the matrix structure. Now, this chart here shows you an example of a matrix structure, and it's put out here for a college of business. All right. Now, if I was to look at where I might fit into this matrix structure, I teach in a management department, so I would be in this row over here. And then I also teach undergraduate courses, so I'd be in the first column, and you'd find me right in this box. And what that means is that I would, on one side of things, report to the chairperson of the management department, and on the other side, I would also report to the dean of undergraduate education. All right. And what this does is this helps to make sure that I am not focusing my attention too much on one area or the other, because the goals of the management department might be different from the goals of the dean of undergraduate education. And if I'm too focused on what my department needs, I might not be meeting the needs of the undergraduate program. But if I'm too focused on what the undergraduate program needs, I might not be meeting the needs of my department. And that's where the matrix structure can help. It's important to remember, however, that the matrix structure is not perfect and it may actually impose some challenges itself. All right. And one of the biggest challenges that can be created by the matrix structure is when two different leaders have very different goals and these goals are so far apart that rather than complementing each other, they're actually in conflict with each other. And our employees find themselves in a position where they're trying to meet the demands of both of the groups that they report to, and it's virtually impossible. And essentially, what can happen in these situations is we have a little bit of a unity of command issue, and employees struggle to meet the needs of their supervisors and the organization. Another type of organizational structure that we can see is called a virtual organization. This is sometimes referred to as a modular or network organization. And basically, what we have here is we have a very small core organization that's kind of a central node. And these are our employees of the company. And then what we do is we outsource other functions. So we might, instead of having a marketing department, we might outsource our marketing functions. And instead of having an accounting department, we might outsource our accounting functions. This figure here illustrates what a virtual organization might look like. And what you see in this figure is at the central node of the organization, you have the executive group. And like I said before, these are the actual employees of our company. And then all these other groups out here, the advertising agency, the research and development consulting firm, the factories, the sales reps, these are all outside members of the organization. They're not actually employees of the organization, but they're contracted or outsourced, so to speak, to perform different functions. And the advantage that we can see to this virtual structure here is it can give us a little bit of flexibility in terms of it's a lot easier to modify what your needs are for advertising when you don't have a whole staff that is taking care of that for you. The other thing that this does, this allows the company itself to be focused on what its core competencies are while relying on those that it partners with, those that it contracts with to take care of things that are not within the company's core competencies. We can also see organizations structured by teams. Okay, and when we do this, we kind of eliminate the chain of command and we really empower our people while reducing the hierarchy within the organization. And probably one of the most notable organizations to use a team structure that we've seen in recent years is Zappos. And Zappos transitioned to something called a holacracy. And a holacracy is a type of structure where people are grouped into what they call circles, which are teams that perform functions, and there are no actual leaders within these circles. Okay, and an employee may be a member of multiple circles within a holacracy, just like they can be a member of multiple teams within the organization. And what they essentially are responsible for doing is meeting the needs of their different teams as opposed to reporting to a specific manager. As we try to identify the right structure for our organizations, we often find ourselves in a position where we need to downsize. And this is where we're trying to make the organization a little more lean. So we may sell off units, we may have to reduce staff. But ultimately, what we're doing when we downsize is we're taking a look at what is it that the organization needs compared to what we have today, and how do we need to modify the structure to make those two things align. From an organizational behavior standpoint, downsizing poses some significant risks for the organization. Anytime we are going to take and lessen employees' job security, we're going to create a situation where we are putting job satisfaction at risk, we're putting organizational commitment at risk, and so on and so forth. So it's very important to think about strategies for downsizing to being successful. All right. And one thing that we can do to make downsizing successful is we can invest. Okay, so look at our downsizing as not just where do we make cuts, but how are we realigning the organization. All right, so maybe we're cutting a department that's not very profitable, but we're investing more into a core competency. All right, that's one strategy for downsizing. It's also very important that we communicate with our people. All right, there shouldn't really be many shocks about what's happening. We need to have some transparency with our people and also allow them to participate in the process. If we collect feedback from our employees, they may actually have some great ideas for us and they may feel a little more valued through this process. All right, but the key here is we cannot just be checking the boxes as we look at communication and participation. All right. So if we are communicating but we're not hearing our people, or if we are communicating but not being fully transparent, that is not going to help us get through downsizing successfully. Similarly, if we create groups to provide feedback and participate in the downsizing process and allow them some perception of decision making capability, but then we don't actually take their thoughts and their contributions and incorporate them into our decisions, then that basically means that there's an illusion of participation, but there's not actual participation, and it's really not going to support what we're trying to do to be successful through downsizing. We also need to look at how do we provide assistance for people who are eliminated from the organization through the downsizing process. Okay, so do we provide extended severance packages? Do we figure out ways to help them with their benefits? All right, and this is critical. Now, often managers will overlook this because they'll view their responsibilities as being to those who are currently with the organization, not those who are exiting the organization. But the problem is that survivors of downsizing often don't fare very well because they deal with additional workloads, they deal with a lot of stress in terms of the downsizing process. And if they're watching their colleagues leave the organization and not be treated well on the way out, then they're not going to deal very well with this. So providing assistance to those who are exiting the organization through downsizing actually helps the survivors of downsizing who remain with the organization. Other terms that you'll hear related to organizational structure are the mechanistic model versus the organic model. And the mechanistic model, it looks a lot like what we talked about with a bureaucracy before, right? So there's high specialization, we kind of have some rigid departments, there's a clear chain of command, narrow spans of control, centralization, and formalization. Okay, the organic model, we're looking more at cross functional teams, cross hierarchical teams, meaning we have teams with people from different levels. We're a little more free with our information. We have wider spans of control. We're decentralized and not quite as formal as the mechanistic model. Now, how do we decide between a mechanistic structure and an organic structure? Well, one of the key things we need to look at is what is our strategy framework for our organization? Okay. Now, as we think about our strategy framework, we're trying to provide value to the customer. And value is the relationship between the utility that we provide and the cost to the customer. So, with an innovation strategy, what we're doing is we're not necessarily so much focused on the cost to the customer. I mean, that is something that matters, but it's not our focus. Our focus is on increasing the utility through new processes, new procedures, new ways of meeting market needs. Okay. Then we have the cost minimization strategy where we're not worried about changing the utility so much as we are reducing the cost. And then an imitation strategy, what we're really trying to do is look at what the competition is doing and match what they're doing. Now, generally speaking, if we have an innovation strategy, a more organic model works well for us. A loose structure with low specialization, low formalization, and decentralization, because this allows people with the freedom to innovate. All right. Having said that, some formalization can help with innovation because people do like to know what their budgets are and what they can do within their job. But generally speaking, a more organic structure is going to support an innovation strategy. Okay. If we're focused on cost minimization, however, a mechanistic model works very well because we have tight control, there's work specialization, formalization, high centralization, and all of these things support minimizing our costs because they create efficiencies. All right. If we have a more imitation strategy, this is kind of a mix of loose and tight properties. So a mechanistic and organic blend tends to work well for this type of strategy. Another important component to identifying the appropriate structure for our organization is the organization's size. As organizations get larger, structure becomes more and more important. So we tend to see organic structures more in smaller organizations than we do in larger organizations. But it's important to remember that the impact of size becomes less important on structure as the organization grows. All right, so if you think about it this way, an organization that has 5 people could probably have an organic structure. If we increase in size to 10, that organic structure is probably still going to work. At 15, it might still work. Okay, if we get to 50, we might add a little more structure into our organization. If we get up to 500 people, we're going to need significantly more structure. If we get up to 10,000 people, we're still going to need more structure, but we've probably got some decent structure in place from when we were at 500. If we get up to 20,000, that's not going to require that much more structure than when we were at 10,000. So basically, as the organization grows, the importance of organization size on the amount of structure needed starts to decrease. Another important factor to our organization structure is technology, okay, and our access to technology. An example of how technology can impact our organization structures. I used to work for a company that had no geographic component to structure. People were grouped based upon function and customer, okay? But this was only possible because we had a lot of video technology, video conferencing technology, and other ways to facilitate communication. Had we not had these technologies to facilitate communications across geographic barriers, we would have had to had a completely different organizational structure. Another important factor that will influence an organization's structure is the organization's environment, or those things that are impacting the organization's performance. All right, organizations need to develop structures that are going to allow them to succeed within the context in which they are trying to succeed. All right, so dynamic environments create a little more uncertainty for managers than static ones do. So we may need to have a little more flexibility, a little more autonomy for managers in dynamic environments than we do in those that have less uncertainty to them. Another important thing to think about is that one of the greatest things that has impacted organizational structure in recent years has been social media. Organizations didn't used to have social media departments, but all of a sudden, trending negatively on Twitter or Instagram became a serious risk for organizations. And we started to see social media departments emerge within organizations. And these departments are designed just to manage an organization's presence on social media because their presence on social media is so important within the current environment. Now, putting it all together, the more dynamic our environment is, the greater complexity it has, and the greater the scarcity of resources, the more we are going to benefit from an organic structure. And the reason for that is the organic structure is going to allow us to adapt to these things. However, as the complexity environment simplifies, or the dynamism stabilizes, or resources become more abundant, we're going to benefit from a mechanistic structure. And the reason for that is the mechanistic structure is going to allow us to be more efficient in these types of environments so that we can capitalize upon that. Cultural guidelines for our behavior also shape our organizational structure, and we refer to these cultural guidelines as institutions. All right, and some examples of things that will shape our structure here are regulatory pressures. All right, an example here would be consider OSHA. All right, OSHA is the government agency responsible for maintaining safe workplaces. If OSHA were to crack down on a specific safety violation, that would influence how we would structure our organizations because we would probably want to put more resources into areas that would ensure that we were in compliance. All right, then we have simple inertia. I remember years ago I started at a company, and when I got to that company, I looked at what they were doing, and I couldn't believe how they were servicing the customer. And I raised a few questions about the long lead times that we had for delivering products and so on. And I was basically told, "Oh, this is how it's always done, and we work just fine." That's an example of inertia. Then we have our culture, and these are obviously just all sorts of different aspects of our society that are going to influence how we work. So, for example, in a culture that has a lot of value placed on power, we might see more hierarchical organizations. So, when power distance is important, hierarchy is going to be important. When power distance is not important, we may be more likely to see an organic structure. And then we have fads or trends. All right. So I've got a picture of Google up here because sometimes Google does things with its structure, and the world will look at it and say, hey, we want to be like Google. And it will be something where companies will try to imitate Google's structure just to send a signal to stockholders. All right. And that's an example of fads or trends. Whatever type of structure your organization has, it's important to recognize that the structure has significant effects on the members of the organization. And it really is impossible to generalize. All right, so for many of us, an organic structure sounds very appealing. I personally like to have a lot of autonomy in my work, but not everybody prefers this. For some people, having a lack of standardization and having some ambiguity in the workplace could be their absolute workplace nightmare. So we don't want to look at everything that we discussed in this lesson today and say, "Oh my gosh, we need to have an organic structure." That's not actually accurate. We need to have a structure that fits our organization, the organization's goals, and the members of the organization. A couple of key points that you want to make sure you understand as we wrap up this video is that work specialization contributes to higher employee productivity. Essentially, work specialization allows us to realize some efficiencies in the workplace. All right. Additionally, there's no evidence that supports a direct relationship between span of control and employee satisfaction or employee performance. So, when we're thinking about what our span of control should be, there's not a uniform answer there. We really need to look at the span of control based upon the work being done. All right. There is, however, fairly strong evidence that links centralization and job satisfaction, meaning that decentralization or less centralization is associated with higher satisfaction. But again, as we discussed just a moment ago, not all of these findings are universal. So we do need to consider the context. All right. And finally, national culture can influence the preference for structure, as the culture that people grow up in, live in, and are accustomed to obviously is going to have some influence over what type of structure they like to work in. And as we summarize this lesson here, we want to remember that there are a variety of different factors that influence the structural design of our organization. And then that structural design is going to influence performance of the organization, performance of the employees, and satisfaction of the employees. But the relationship between structural design and performance and structural design and satisfaction is going to be moderated by individual differences in cultural norms. And basically, what that means is what the right design is for the in order to achieve top performance and high satisfaction is also influenced by individual differences. All right. And that pretty much wraps up our lesson here today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, and we'll talk to you soon.